Huazontles, Chenopodium nuttalliae, and sometimes listed as Chenopodium berlanderii nuttalliae. It is a goosefoot or a chenopod type plant domesticated by the Native Americans, especially the Aztecs, although the eastern United States and Canadian North Americans had a very similar species, if not even just a variety of this plant domesticated as well. The primary usage that you read about today is the flower buds. So this sort of a thing here is steamed and cooked and eaten. I'll put some pictures of that up, but you can easily find that by Googling it. But I've never grown this plant before, and I'm totally unfamiliar with it. And I thought it had a lot of potential, so I want to talk a little bit about my experiences with it. Having never grown these before, I ended up having to consult an expert. I have some friends who are from the area around Mexico City and Mexico, and I brought them over to help explain to me how exactly you go about eating this, cooking this, selecting this. And what they told me is at the point here where the stems, the leaves, and the seed heads start to turn red, these are too far gone. This is very ornamental and very attractive, and it's very reminiscent of some varieties of quinoa. And that's no surprise because quinoa is also a Chenopodium species native to the Americas. So these are close relatives. I think they might even cross. I'm pretty sure I looked that up in some research papers. In any case, what I was told is that what you want is something that's mostly green. A little pink tinge maybe is okay, but you really want as green as you can get them. So most of them in this area are too far gone. Before I grew these, I was reading some in books and some online about people struggling to grow them in some of the climates that maybe are somewhat more different than Mexico City. And these are the observations. Number one, these plants vary tremendously just individually. This variety would be an excellent variety for either grain or for selecting for the flower buds. Some of the other ones that are more loose and open, like this one, not so much. The plant architecture is highly variable, and I think some selection could be done with these to improve on that. This group isn't quite as mature. You can see that these are more along the green sense of things. These are not too bad, but they don't have still the best. Like stuff like this is not a great habit for grain or for eating the buds. You want these things to be pretty tightly packed. So this is pretty nice. But the other thing I wanted to mention is how you grow these plants seems to hugely affect their physical morphology. So this group is in full sun. It's in fairly poor soil that was relatively unamended, and it's in a fairly dry spot. This group is in a little bit better soil, also in full sun. Now this group, which is pretty enormous, I have planted right next to a chicken pen for growing out young chicks. Now this group has been cut fairly heavily. I gave a lot of this to my friends, but the addition of all the extra nitrogen and water from the chickens has resulted in a much bigger, much more leafier plant, but for the most part, it's also resulted in flower clusters or bud clusters that are a lot more open and airy and are not very tightly packed together. There are a few, like this one is pretty decent, but I think that's also a genetic thing. I think there is a combination of genetic components at work here and cultural components. It seems to me that the more nitrogen and water these get, it wrecks up their potential for being used as the steamed flower buds. If you wanted to use these as a leafy green, which is done, if you look at Carol Deppy's book, The Tao of Vegetable Gardening, she talks about this plant, I'm pretty sure, in the leafy greens section of that book, and I know she uses it that way. And you know, if you're going to do leafy greens, okay, but I don't know if you can do well at both. I'm not sure this plant will excel at producing leafy greens and the steamed buds or a grain crop, because apparently you can also produce a grain crop out of this, somewhat like quinoa, which is what I really like to try. later on. So I want to show a few more pictures of a few more interesting observations I've made on this plant. Here's another group near my glorious sunflower plantation. These are also closer to a chicken pen, but this is a harsher soil in this spot, and I think a little bit brighter sun exposure. And I've got a little bit denser heads on these, but these are still big plants. And I hope you can see the difference between these that have a lot more nitrogen and the ones that I showed earlier with a lot less nitrogen. And I want to do one more demonstration of this plant. So having never grown this before, I planted a lot of it out in a lot of different spots intentionally because I wanted to see what it would do. These ones I planted in between a row of chapalote Mexican flint popcorn, which is monstrously tall, and a row of sunflowers. It got heavily shaded, and hopefully you can see these are really pitiful plants. Now they were stressed for water and they were stressed for nitrogen, but they were also heavily shaded. And although they're producing something, and this is not ideal by any stretch, so clearly it's not just an issue of having these plants be too lush and they won't perform. If they don't get enough sunlight, they also won't perform well either. It really seems to need lots of sun, relatively poor soil. This is a plant that seems like it would thrive under neglect. Here is a lamb's quarter. This is Chenopodium album, and this is an extremely common weed here. Lamb's quarter is edible, and any kind of basic foraging books or videos will talk about that. Very similar to Huauzontle and quinoa. When I first planted out the Huauzontle, I couldn't tell the difference between it and a lamb's quarter, but as it's matured, the differences are more obvious, and after having spent a year growing it, I can pick them out pretty easily. The Huauzontles have a thinner leaf. That's the best way I can put it. It's a smaller, thinner leaf, maybe less toothed on the margins. So, have I eaten this? Yes, I have eaten the steamed flower buds, and they have a very, very mild flavor. I ate some raw flower buds, and the flavor is also fairly mild, but it's extremely similar to a raw lamb's quarter. So if you know what that's like, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you don't, I'm sure you can find some in your nearest weedy vacant lot and try some. It's not a bad taste, but it's somewhat more strong. The cooked flower buds are very mild, very tender, just a soft leafy green sort of a flavor and texture. Nothing offensive. I have seen a good bit of stuff online about people complaining about these things being bitter. I can't really speak to that. Maybe it's the climate, maybe it's the soil, maybe it's how the plants are grown. And then there's just no accounting for individual subjectivity in terms of taste. And I'll tell you right up front that my sense of taste and smell is not the greatest. So to me anyway, these don't taste like anything offensive at all. And I think it's a great plant. If you're talking about productivity, total versus say broccoli, which would be a similar plant, this absolutely outstrips broccoli, probably 5 to 1, if not 10 to 1. This group over here, I cut at least 2 bushels off of this about 10 days ago and gave away to some friends, and there's still plenty more here to be had. So, and my friends told me that if you keep cutting it, as long as you don't kill the plant, it'll keep producing more. Not as good as the first flush, much like broccoli, but still you're getting way more productivity from this. And it does have some insect and disease issues, but nothing like broccoli does here, nothing like the brassicas, and far more tolerant of heat and drought. And if it pans out that I can use this for a grain after the fact, this would be one of the best, most amazing crops I can think of. And this would be a tremendous crop. So, really excited about this plant. And as far as ornamental edibles go, you can see these red plants as they mature are just as nice as quinoa. quinoa is essentially ungrowable where I'm at. It can't mature in a rainy or humid climate. Supposedly this stuff can, but we'll see. I've tried quinoa before, quite a few times, different varieties, and quinoa's always been a bust, but I am really amazed at how similar these are to quinoa. I mean, the maturing plants, especially those red ones over there, from a distance it just looks exactly the same. So, Huauzontle, thanks for watching.